to everyone in the Hill Life Group. Hope this podcast finds you doing well. We're going to continue our analysis and in-depth study of the book of Matthew. We'll be in chapter 27 today and primarily be in verses 41 through 44. And our lesson today is entitled Crucified. Now, when we think about what Jesus did for us, our thoughts immediately go to the cross. His crucifixion demonstrated that he intended to sacrifice his life once and for all so that we could be saved. As we kind of recap a little bit, starting in verse kind of 27 through 40 here, the Romans brought the cruelty of crucifixion into Judea. Since Jesus' death sentence was pronounced by a Roman governor, he would therefore die according to Roman methods. So after the brutal beatings that Jesus had to endure, that he chose to endure, he was forced to carry his cross toward the place of execution. Now the criminals that were also crucified with him walked in this procession. As he was weakened by the beatings, the soldiers forced a man named Simon, who was a Cyrenian, to carry the cross the remainder of the way to their destination of Golgotha, which literally means the skull. So as we approach here in verse 41, Jesus is on the cross, and the chief priests with the scribes and the elders are mocking him. So I'll go ahead and read chapter 27 of Matthew, verses 41 through 44. In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him and said, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He has put his trust in God. Let God rescue him now, if he wants him, for he said, 'I am God's son.'" In the same way, even the criminals who were crucified with him kept taunting him. Now, as we know, as we studied a few weeks ago, just 1 week earlier, the crowds lined the streets outside of Jerusalem in order to welcome Jesus as the Son of David, who is coming in the name of the Lord. And one can only imagine or wonder how many of those same people were a part of the mob that was passing by Golgotha at this stage of the game. So they were not only mocking Jesus, they were not the only ones mocking Jesus. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders were too. Now to focus on kind of on the scribes and the elders independently, the scribes were more than just copiers of Scripture. They were teachers of the law. They should have known more about God's promises concerning the Messiah than anyone. These experts of the law and prophecy, they should have recognized Jesus' fulfillment of Scripture throughout his life, but instead they chose to join the mob and mocking him. The elders, they refer to members of the Sanhedrin. These men, they sat in council as the supreme court and chief administrative body of Israel. And although Rome gave the Jews self-rule at that time, it was limited. So these elders, they should have been men of integrity and dignity, but instead they too were choosing mockery at this point. And they're mocking him by saying, he is the King of the Jews, which was on the placard above Jesus. And surely, their thought is, surely the anointed one should possess the ability to break loose from the cross. But what they were naive in realizing is that he actually did have the power to do so, but he chose not to. He willingly endured mockery, pain, and suffering on the cross so that salvation was made possible, both for you and for me. And as they continued to ridicule Jesus, they even said that they might believe in him if he were to descend from the cross. So even though most of them, they probably at minimal heard what Jesus had done, if not physically seen some of the miracles, some of the acts that Jesus had performed. It's like they wanted to see it one more time, see it for their very eyes, see Jesus in what they perceived more than likely to be his most physical restricted state, and they wanted him to come down from that cross, and then they would choose to believe in him. They also continue to mock him in verse 43, focusing on when he says that he is God's son. It was unbelievable to these religious leaders that the Son of God would submit to such suffering and shame as what Jesus was experiencing. And to kind of backtrack a little bit, it says he has put his trust in God in verse 43. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. That additional phrase right there, I'm kind of laughingly taking pleasure that he suggested that even God would want him in that state, in that physical state that he's in. Verse 44, to kind of compound what the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were doing. In the same way, even the criminals who were being crucified with Jesus, they joined in the taunting. But we know as we continue to read Scripture that somewhere during the day, the one on Jesus' right hand saw the way Jesus dealt with the pain and approaching his death. And he recognized that no one could say or do the things that Jesus was doing under excruciating pain and crucifixion unless he was in fact the Messiah. So we kind of covered a few aspects of mockery there. Now we're going to focus on abandonment or forsakenness in verses 45 through 49. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, He is calling for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, fixed it on a reed, and offered him a drink. But the rest said, Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. Okay, so we even in Jesus' final hours, the nature itself reacted to its creator being crucified. The brightness of midday faded as darkness flooded the whole land. Jesus had been suffering on the cross for about 6 hours, and these final moments came in the last 3. And his cry was probably the most significant as he cries out to his Father in agony. The pain must have been excruciating from the nails in his hands and feet, the crown of thorns on his brow, and constantly pushing himself up to breathe. People actually debate as to whether God turned his face away from the Son as the sin of the world came upon him, but many scholars believe that it was actually Jesus quoting the first lines of Psalm 22, which ends in victory and not in defeat. So, in picking up in verse 47, Jesus' cry, it's not only been debated by critics and believers throughout the years, but it was also misunderstood by those who were standing there. The words Eloi, Eloi literally mean my God, but there were some people who misconstrued that as him calling Elijah, which means, Jehovah is God. And that break here in Matthew 27:47, verse 47 to 48, John's account actually records Jesus quietly saying, I'm thirsty. So that's what the transition into 48. That's why immediately one of them got a sponge, filled it with sour wine to help take away some of that pain that Jesus was having, fixed it on a reed, and that's really the only way they could reach him when he was on the cross, and offered it to him. So the kindness of that single individual should definitely be, which was notated, should be remembered. But the rest of the crowd wasn't as sympathetic as that person was as they continued to mock him. We'll culminate this study with the last few verses 50 through 52. Jesus shouted again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was split in two from top to bottom. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So again, Jesus shouts with a loud voice. Theories about his immediate death are bound, and some people believe it was blood loss or suffocation. But due to the fact that he had to actually push himself up by pressing on the spike that was through his feet just in order to exhale every single time. But what I want us to focus on here in verse 50, he says, and gave up his spirit. He had sovereign control over his life, and Jesus also has sovereign control over his death, whatever the physical implications may have been. Jesus gave up his spirit. He gave up his spirit, and he died because he loved you and loved me, and he did it voluntarily. Verse 51, suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary, which some scholars believe it was up to 4 inches thick, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet tall, was split in two from top to bottom. The thick drape was passed, no one could, but the high priest could actually pass through this curtain and enter the Holy of Holies, as he could even only do that once a year to make atonement for the sins of the nation. So the fact that this veil is torn from top to bottom actually allows us to have communication to God through Jesus, through his blood, and through the sacrifice of his body. So as you're going throughout this week, I want you guys to remember the crucifixion, what it means to you, how you can relay that to other people, and how it can also impact their lives just as it has impacted yours. I hope you guys have a blessed week.